Oh, okay.
I have turned the audio on.
Oh, okay. Okay, so welcome to the April Discovering History seminar, and coming just before Easter. I think when I did the year's program, I missed that key point. Right, I want to welcome you to the seminar, and just these seminars are a collaboration between La Trobe University, the Goldfields Library, the Bendigo Regional Archive Centre, and now the Golden Dragon Museum. I want to acknowledge that tonight we're on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. And now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Dr. Charles Fay, who is Emeritus Associate Professor in History at La Trobe. And Charles is going to be talking to us about Making the Family Farm, a view from the Northern Plains. Thank you, Charles.
Now, how do I do this? It's brilliant. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. I'm going to quote first of all from Manning Clark. Manning Clark wrote in the late 70s, in one of his volumes of his History of Australia, the volume that dealt with, I think, the period from about 1850 to 1888. And it really has a rather, I don't know, I suppose you could call it crude, even stupid view of life in rural Australia. And my old boss, John McCarty, was reading that book back in the late 1970s. And he reacted very unkindly to it. He found it a very disturbing account of rural Australia. And that prompted him to write an article which he called the Inland Corridor. So just to give you, set the context, here's a quote from Manning Clark's view of Australia, rural Australia. He said that, quote, by 1880, it looked as though the ancient, uncouth continent would destroy all human endeavours to create a class of small property owners between the big men and their employees. Once again, as in the convict period, the bush had barbarised its would-be robbers and destroyers. In the cities, belief in progress had not been diminished by the survival of barbarism in the Australian bush. Crazy. And John McCarty reacted to that by saying that he had a different view of rural Australia. And he said to him it was more a story of progress, movement, and achievement of pastoralists, miners, farmers, and bushwalkers creating industries and building homes and raising families. There was overall a progress towards material welfare in a democratic society and progress towards happiness. And Manning Clark's nonsense hasn't sort of quite died. It's a rather silly article in Agricultural History, a British journal, which talks about the sort of failure of farming in South Australia. And one of the quotes from that is, "The loss of soil fertility, widespread clearing of land, and application of European farming methods that were not suited to the environment cost the state in terms of soil degradation and loss of biodiversity." And again, another young historian whose book I think is absolute stupidity.
I hope Cameron's not listening to it.
What? He won't be listening to me. A guy by Cameron, a book by Cameron Muir, and he said, modern agriculture has been shaped by prejudice, fear, and social division. So what I want to do today is to sort of take McCarty's idea of the family farm and sort of look at how the family farm emerges in rural Victoria. And McCarthy sort of put up this model of the family farm. He said the newly married young farmer had to hire wage labour for the first 15 years if he could afford it. For a few years, the family labour equalled the needed labour, so you had sons and daughters to work on the farm. But then, he says, the second surplus son had to work for a neighbouring farmer with young children, or go shearing, or if lucky, establish a new farm. And finally, the labour is in balance once again when the farmer retires and his son takes over. So I think McCarty's got it right in the sense that there is this dynamic thing, the family farm. I'm not sure that model is quite accurate, and I'm going to sort of try and sort of test that model using the wonderful diary of James of Wanurp. But I also want to make a suggestion that these bush barbarians of Manning Clark's weren't a sort of totally illiterate group, and one of the things I've been doing is collecting papers of farmers. There is the keeping of diaries by rural families in Australia is quite common, or was quite common, and probably a process of the fact that by the 1870s, 1880s, almost all farmers had Australian-born farmers have been through the system of free, secular and compulsory education and can read and write. But it also, I think some of those coming from overseas brought that sort of ambition to write with them. And so this is just some of the few of the sort of people I've been looking at to sort of build up a picture of rural Australia. For those of you who have read our Mallee book, you'll notice Charlie up there, who kept a diary almost every day from 1896 to about 1954. But tonight, I'm going to look at James Harris James. Okay, so just to put him in context, next slide, it's got his light on it, yep. Next slide, James Harris James, and you'll understand the name in a sec, was a sort of settler on the northern plains, just north of Bendigo. And I am firmly of the opinion that by the end of the 1870s and 1880s, farming had established itself fairly successfully in the Victorian countryside. So you can see from this chart that by 1891, the census records about almost 70,000 farms in Victoria. And you can see that there is also a large group, something like 500 individuals who own properties of 10,000 acres or more. But you can see that they're largely in the Western District, in those great lush pastoral districts. And just moving on, you can see that that this is from the 1911 census. You can see the distribution of farming and pastoral workers. And I suppose my main interest in recent years is, this is not working, but has been the Mallee, the Wimmera and the North and Plains. Although I've become more interested in the Northeast in recent years, because that's where my family settled. Now, just to give you some sense of the position of farmers in the community, this is some work I've done with probated estates. And I've looked at a sample of estates probated in 1911. And you can see from this that as a group, farmers and pastoralists are probably the sort of leave a higher median estate than most other groups in Victorian society. And moving on, you can see that farmers and pastoralists, and again, it's mostly farmers, 35% of those farmers leaving an estate left an estate of £1,000 or more. So what I'm trying to suggest is that while Manning Clark wanted to suggest that the process of settling in rural Australia led to nothing but barbarism and brutality and all the rest of it, I'm trying to suggest that what emerges in the course of the 1870s and 1880s is a large group of propertied people, and my James family fits into that. I'll just move on. So, the James family Cornwall, the two, I'll show you a picture, I'll show you the shipping list in a sec. John and James, John James, this family's terrible the way they use it. I mean, how would you like to be called James? James, yeah. Anyway. John and his wife, Susan Harris, were born in Cornwall. John, where her father was an agricultural labourer. They married in Cornwall in 1845, and I think, it's a bit unclear, but I think they had a couple of children in Cornwall before they moved to Australia, all of whom died. You can only pick that up. It's not on. It's on one of the birth certificates of their children in Australia. So they come out to Australia in the late 1840s, and they have how many children? One. They have the following children in Australia. John was born in 1852. Richard, and he's known in a diary as Dick, was born in 1853. William Harris, born in 1856. James Harris, so he's taken his mother's name, James Harris, and he's our diarist. He's born in 1859. Susan James, born in 1861, and Caroline, 1866. So what's that, about 7 children, is it? But there were a couple of children, as I said, who died. Now, when it comes to Australia, James Senior works as a carter in Collingwood, and he stays in Collingwood until somewhere in the 1850s. Somewhere around about 1859, he purchases land at Spring Hill in the Smeaton district. And I don't know if any of you and those on the internet know Smeaton, but Smeaton is an area that was settled by Captain Hepburn in the 1830s. He dies, I think, in the 1850s. And rather than sort of get involved in the sort of dirty work of running a sheep station, his sons basically let the farm out in the Spring Hill district, and that becomes a springboard for people to get a chance to sort of farm in Victoria. And the Spring Hill district in Smeaton becomes initially a very prosperous farming area in Victoria. In the 1850s into the 1860s, the area around Creswick, Spring Hill, Clunes was the main wheat producing area in Victoria. And it continues so throughout to the end of the 1860s. In the Spring Hill district, James Senior could only afford a small property. I think it was at the most, he and his eldest son worked about 150 acres. A lot of the farmers in the area got onto land through a thing called the 42nd section of the 1860 Carroll pick me up here, the 1865 Land Act, and you get lots of little farmers. And Creswick is good because you've got, and Smeaton is good because you've got gold miners who'll buy your products. You've got a market in Ballarat. But for those of you who have read the diary of the so-called Welsh swagman, when he goes through that area in the 1860s, and I don't trust the man, but when he goes through the area in the 1860s, he talks about how weeds and whatnot have overrun the district and how the farming is in a bit of a crisis. So, like so many people from that area in the 1860s, particularly in the late 1860s, early 1870s, the James family move out of Smeaton and go north to the plains of northern Victoria. One of the family stays behind, and that's William Harris. And again, this is important that he stays behind. He trains as a primary teacher, gets a job as a primary teacher, and stays as a primary teacher in that region for most of his life. And the fact that he has a job as a primary teacher is very important for some of the other family. Okay, just to give you a look at the shipping manifest. I don't know if you can see that. I put my glasses on and I can see it. You can see James John, agricultural labourer, 28, born Truro, Cornwall. He's a Wesleyan, so he's not one, even at the start of things, he's not one of Manning Clark's bush barbarians. He can read and write, and he's carrying a Bible with him. And you can see that his wife, Susan, lists herself on the shipping list as a housekeeper, and she can read but not write. I also love this. Years ago, and I lost the source of it, but a person, Joseph Chappell, and Joseph Chappell also migrates from Cornwall a bit later in 1854, and we've got this wonderful reference he's got when he leaves Cornwall, and to quote it is, "This is to certify that Joseph Chappell worked with me for upwards of 5 years. I've always found him a steady, honest and industrious young man, and I very much regret him leaving this country, as I know his equal I shall not be able to get." The interesting thing is that Chappell sort of eventually became a neighbour and quite friendly person with the Harris family, the James family. So, gosh, it gets you. It's a trick, that one. Okay, so selectors coming into this district had a number of conditions they had to go through, or steps they had to go through to get a property. And again, speaking to people like Carol, I'm speaking to people who know this quite well, but for the rest of you, they had to, but first of all, when they took up a block of land, they had to go under a licence. And under a licence, they had to pay a rent to the Crown of 2 shillings per acre. And a licence could be revoked at any time. They could be kicked off the land. After they've been through 3 years of the licence and done some improvements, they could then take out a lease for 7 years, and that was again at 2 shillings per acre, not per act as it says there. And in the first 3 years, they had to totally fence the property, cultivate 10% of the holding, build a permanent home. They had to reside 3 years, and they could take up a maximum of 320 acres if they'd selected before in southern Victoria, they could only take up the balance of 320 acres. And it was open to all men over 18 and all single women older than 18. So this is the opportunity for the James family to move north. And it's quite fascinating when you look at the selection files of the James family and their neighbours. You can see that a lot of the people moving into this area know each other before they go there. They're all they're not all coming, but a large number of them are coming from the Smeaton Clunes area. And luckily, we have this picture of what they were going towards in the 1870s. So you can see if you had a sort of a county plan of Bendigo, the county of Bendigo, Terrick is the parish immediately north of Wanurp, where the James family took up land. And this is a Terrick Plains, you can see, but it is basically a treeless grasslands. And that poses several problems when you're trying to sort of make a farm. Again, I've got another diary of which James knows quite well, the Richard Pope diary, and he had sort of worked in Illinois before coming to Australia. When he was area, it reminds him very much of the Midwest of the United States, those plains there. So with a grassland, I suppose your major problem is that you don't have anything to build your fences with. You don't have anything to build your house with. You've got to purchase those things. So the James family basically, when they fence their property, they have to use post and wire fencing. And obviously, the invention of barbed wire and wire makes possible the settlement of these areas. I remember there was once a fantastic curator at the Museum of Victoria who could keep an audience. I saw him in OU keep an audience enthralled talking about barbed wire. He tells this wonderful story of coming past a farm and seeing a bit of barbed wire he didn't have, and he got out and cut it. And he turned around, there was a farmer behind him. But anyway, you can see from my next chart that what this basically looks at the whole of the Echuca Shire, which it's not just open grasslands. In the Echuca Shire, there's I suppose there's open box forests, which took more clearing. But you can see that slowly at first, the average area cultivated on each farm slowly increased and starts to sort of gallop up in the 1880s and then shoots up in the 1890s, and I'll talk some more about that later on because it's got a lot to do with changing farm technology. Unfortunately, these statistics end in 1902. I would love to get the next year, which was the year of the Great Federation drought. Missing, unfortunately. If we go to the next slide, you can see that this rush of this is landholders in the Shire, and you can see a rush of people coming in the 1870s, peaking, I suppose, in about 1877. Now, it's quite fascinating when you read the reports of the local Crown Lands officer. He talks about how in 1870 the 1869 Land Act comes into effect in February 1870, and the local Crown Land bailiff talks about how it was preceded by abundant rains, the grass grows brilliantly, which attracts people to this area, and massive population increase. But we get, in the late 1870s, one of those things we all know about in Australia nowadays, an El Nino year, and you can see that the drought of the 1870s basically leads to dramatic drop in the number of selectors in the region. There's a bit of a recovery in the early 1880s, but then there's a slow decline through until the 1890s, and then it tapers out. So there are great problems in sort of trying to settle in that district. Now let's go back to the James family, because I think they provide a good example of the process of settling. And a senior who never selected before selected 311 acres in Wanurp, and he's aged 44. By this stage, his son Richard is 21. He selects 131 acres, and John Jr. selected 280 acres. But he, after working with the family for a number of years, decides that he wants to go out on his own, and he sells his property to his father. Now, it's very interesting. He's obviously, I don't know how much his father paid for him to sort of make the improvements on that property. But one of the things that enables him to move south, he moves to a place called Knowsley, which is just near here. One of the things that he's able to do when he moves to his new farm is he gets a loan from his brother, who's the school teacher. So you can see the family working together to provide capital. So by 1881, by about 1890, 1891, the James family has gone through this process of clearing their properties, cultivating their properties, and they've gone from being selectors to freeholders. And in the late 1880s, our diarist, I'll show you a picture of a diary in a sec, our diarist, James Harris James, goes into farming with his father. He works on his father's property, and together by 1881, the family has 712 acres. So they've broken out of that straitjacket of the 320 acres. And James got that right this time, starts his diary, and from 1888 through until the 1930s, he records his farm activities, he records what's going on in the district. And he marries a local Harriet Palmer. I think she might have been a school teacher in 1887, and they have 3 children. Ray is born in 1889, Edith Lillian in 1891, and Glenn in 1894. Now, just to sort of, I'll just give you a picture. You can see, next one, is it? Oops. You can see, it's not, put my glasses on. That's the journal. And it's pretty easy to read, actually. But it looks as though he's recorded most days of the month there. Sometimes he misses a day or two when not much is happening, but it is a fairly good record. And I haven't got much time to sort of give you much of the flavour of it, but I go back to that sort of idea of bush barbarians. I think one thing that keeps this family together that's very important to them is they're coming from Cornwall, they're good Wesleyan Methodists, and the church becomes the centre of their life. So every year, as this entry shows, harvest Thanksgiving services, Mr. Rawlings preached from Bendigo, could not get all people in. So there is this community of very firm Methodists, also Presbyterians and Catholics in the district, probably Anglicans too. But anyway, I think the other thing that's very important to these people is providing their children with a basic education. and the school becomes a very important part of James James's life. So he works to keep the school in good order. He'll take the teacher in when or new teacher who comes to the area. There was one occasion when the teacher was a total drunk, spent all day drinking, and he had to deal with that sort of problem. They have working bees around the church, around the school, so it's very important. And you can see here, a sort of social event from 1895. Presentation of silver kettle to Harry, I think his wife, with inscription by parents of the children attending Pine Grove School. And there's no punctuation very much in this diary, so bear that in mind. Mr. Allday in chair. Mr. Chappell, those friends again, made a presentation, about 100 presents. This is in a small community. Songs, recitations by Mrs. Wilcock, Mr. Graw, Chappell Harris, Harry Yeaman, McGregor. Recitations by Miss R. Ellen and R. Allen and Mr. W. Gamble, after which was followed by dance. Great success. Harriet made a great speech. So the school and the chapel become an incredibly important part of their life. So much goes on around the school. We're going to see later on that one of the sons goes off to Gallipoli. When he comes back, where do they have the meeting? At the school. So here you can see kids. This is a bit later than I'm looking at today. You can see the kids outside the school, 1920. And this is not their Wesleyan chapel, but this is the Mitiamo one, which is just a bit north. But again, I think it's very important that they don't just attend their own chapel. If a good preacher is at Mitiamo, they'll go and see it. And there's one of my favourite parts of the diary is when James Harris James has his moment of conversion. He there's a preacher who comes along, and James goes up to the front of the chapel as God, which is wonderful. And the family is very important in keeping that church going. They get the piano tune for it. It is an integral part of their life. Okay, just pushing on for family. In 1891, the rate book of 1890, we have Richard Dick rated at 311 acres, John Senior and James Harris joint occupiers of 550 acres. Now, you've got these two farms close by. They in the sense that they work they're sort of independent businesses, but they share the work. So at cropping time, they will share the work of stripping the wheat off each other's property, and that can sometimes be a source of friction. There's one point where Dick falls out with his father as they're harvesting, and high words are said. But anyway, they continue. They work these farms together, and again, the diary talks a lot about the food that they eat, and I think this is very important. That would sort of a high standard of living. Whenever they kill a beast, a cow or a pig, they don't just consume it themselves. They take it around the district, sell it to their neighbours so it doesn't go off. By 1898, Richard has married Clara, and she becomes part of the farming family, and she has 110 acres. I said before that Richard had sort of high words with his father. He eventually decides to move away from the family farm and set up at Gonong. And again, this allows James and his father to have more land. And you can see that the daughter has done all right too, because Susan marries into the Yeaman family, and they are very successful farmers in the district. Again, Wesleyans. You can see they come to the area when the sons are able to select land in their own right, and you can see that they get quite a bit of land. Okay, just moving on. Going back to McCarty's model, while James's sons are growing up, he runs the farm with the help of his brother Dick until Dick moves on, and in the 1890s, he cultivates about 60 to 100 acres a year, closer to 100 acres. He runs sheep on the stubble in that farm, and they graze on the native pastures. In the early 90s, he's beginning to fallow his land, which is very important in increasing its fertility. So he's running about 500 acres by himself. His father is around, but by this stage he's not doing very much. In 1905, he experiments with a seed drill, and he starts to use superphosphate on his property. And in the years just before the war, when his eldest sons are coming of age that can help him, he slightly increases the amount of area he crops. So, but just by the war, he's cropping about 120 to 130 acres. They have a small flock of sheep, and that's part of the cycle. The sheep keep the weeds off the fields that he's fallowed. They provide a bit of income. And very importantly, his wife milks in season about 6 to 10 cows per day. So what they've done is they've got a sort of fairly diversified farm by the 1890s. And going back to McCarty's idea, at this stage he's still employing outside labour. He employs harvest labour in the late 1890s, early 1900s for about 26 days per year. And then in 1910, he purchases the great invention of that period, the Mackay combine harvester, a machine that both strips the crop and winnows it. Now, to give you some sense of the diary, I've just got some extracts coming up. You can see that the elder of the family, John James, dies in 1906. There's a rather interesting account of his death there. But what really, the way, all the farm journals, I don't know if it's still the case, the way you judge a person, I think, is by the number of buggies that turn up to a funeral. And Charles Coote in his diary also counts the number of buggies. So you can see that John James was quite a man of the district with 32 buggies at his funeral. Okay. In 1909, James owns 550 acres. He's a tenant of 200, and by 1912, they're still cultivating much the same sort of area. But you can see they've made the next step to sort of providing for the children, and we can see that by 1912, Raymond James, then aged 23, has become a tenant on 414 acres. So not only now we've got the father, but we've got one of the sons. And by 1921, they then make the next step. They bring the two boys, Raymond and Glenn, into farming, and they buy an extra 640 acres. And again, it's pretty clear from the diary that that is a family affair. You can see from the diary that when it comes time to pay off the mortgage on the 640 acres, the money is coming from the family. Okay, now, all is not pleasant on this farm. Poor old, in the early 20th century, both Ray and Glenn have to go to military training when the Labor government introduces compulsory military training. But when the war breaks out, Ray joins up and he goes off to fight at Gallipoli. And you can see here, one of their neighbours has died. 6th of July, got word that Percy Whitfield killed at Dardanelles. Mum and Wilma went down to Whitfield's, heartbroken about Percy, their son. July, got word from Ray, been in trenches a week. Pretty good mail if you think about it. July to May to July. And in the 27th of July, they get word from the Defence Department that Ray was coming home, and they go and his mother goes and picks him up at the Caulfield Military Hospital, and Ray comes home on the 5th of September, and they have a great crowd at Pine Grove, speeches and all the rest of it. So those barbarians brought him home. Okay. Right, so what I'm going to suggest now is that by 1911, 1912, there has developed in this area a very stable system of farming. It's a mixed farming of sort of wheat and sheep and a bit of dairying, and the use of modern machinery is very much a part of it. And just to finish off, you can see the sort of year that the Janes have on their farm. So by the time Ray returns from the war, they're working 3 properties together, and they have quite a substantial enterprise. So in December 1980, they finish harvesting, and they have 855 bags of wheat, 100 bags of oats. The next job that they have to do is they cart that wheat, and they harrow and roll the fallow field in preparation for the coming sowing of the crop. And you'll notice there, they've got a wool check for £245, a lot of money in 1920. In February, they're harrowing and rolling the fallow for the coming crop. They sell lambs, they sell oats, and in March, you can see here, Mum paid £700 principal and interest. So she's paying off one of the son's farms. They drill in the oats, calving, milking in April, and you can see that by May 1919, they have something like 377 acres of wheat in. So they've substantially increased the size of their property. If we go on in July, they go into fallowing, ploughing, they're tailing lambs, they're selling sheep. August, they continue with fallowing, fencing. September, they're finishing the fallowing. And look at, they've got 245 acres of fallow ready for the next year's crop. And you can see that there's this constant sale of stock to bring in extra income. And in October, they're building a new house for one of the sons. November, they start to harvest the oats. They cart the oats in November. They're selling oats at this time. And on the 18th of December, they finished harvesting. And look at this, 1,118 bags, which from my reckoning would be worth about £1,382. They've also got, they don't only use a harvester to crop the crops, they also use a reaper and binder. They have by this stage 447 sheep, and they're getting income from a wool check of 191, and they sell steers. So they really do have, I think, a fairly successful mixed farm. And it's because I would argue they're working it as a family. Now, I just want to end the talk by saying, in a sense, what keeps the sort of family farm going is that it's constantly being broken up, reorganised and resold. Now, I've just done this work with Irish, I'm going to give another talk on the Catholics in a couple of weeks, but you can see that there is a constant turnover of farms. By my calculation, something like a third of farmers who die don't leave a will, so they die intestate. So if you die intestate, the law says you've got to divide it up 1/3 to your wife, 2/3 equally to your children. But the point I'd like to show you from this is that there is this tendency for the farm to be divided not to one son, but to multiple sons and daughters. So you've got that sort of cycle, I think. I don't know if it's still the case in rural Victoria, but there is this tendency for the father to build up the farm and then on his death for it to be broken up into small pieces. So the family farm is in this process of change. And I'll leave it there because I'm going to lose my voice.
Thanks very much, Charles. So questions from people? James?
How did the James family cope with the Federation drought? You sort of glossed over that.
That's quite fascinating. It doesn't seem to have any impact at all.
What do you attribute that to?
I attribute to the fact that they're probably well established by that stage. Through the dry 90s, there are years where their yield is down, but most years they get some crop. It might only be 1 bag to the acre where they normally get, I don't know, probably 3 or 4. But I think that by that stage they have the wherewithal just to retire into their own resources and they ride out the drought very well. I think at this stage the people who are going to really suffer are those who have just moved into the Mallee. But again, I've got my friend Mr. Coot. Doesn't have much impact on him. So it's quite funny. We've got this image of the 1902, 1903 being such a devastating year. You read his diary, and he plants his crop, and then suddenly he says, "Well, there's going to be no crop," but that's it. It just rides it quite successfully. They must have been saving, I think, too.
Debt, was it? Yeah, they didn't have much debt.
No.
So,
No.
Which is
so they could live off the land.
yeah, and they're the land. I mean, they're good gardeners. You can see that in the diary. The neighbours are sort of exchanging. I said before, exchanging food.
Other questions for Charles?
What year did they migrate? You have the shipping list there.
Yeah.
And you said it was 28, and it would have been, it was born in 1830. It would have been
About
1858. But you've got children born in Australia from 1852, so that's kind of quite interesting.
I'll have to check those figures. I think he migrates in the late 40s from memory.
Yeah.
So 45.
Married in 45. Well, they were 15. If that's the case. Maybe the birth dates aren't.
I've made an arithmetic mistake.
Was he? Yeah.
Yeah, I've made an arithmetic mistake.
That happens.
Yeah, because he's as I said on the shipping list, I think he's 28. So
Yeah.
I'll amend that.
I'm really interested in a story because my great grandfather was a wheelwright at Strathfield, say, and then he must have made quite a bit of money, and I think this was sort of a normal thing to do, wasn't it? So then he bought land for his 3 sons north of Bendigo at a place called Pyavella, which isn't far from Maloo or Lockington area. Yeah. So they had a farm there that he worked, but then the sons, you know, they didn't have enough land to really make a go of it. So my grandfather's family ended up moving into Morong to live, while the one son stayed on the farm and was also the local blacksmith and did the repairs for the people around. But that sense of community that you have with everybody working together to help the harvest and everything wasn't necessarily always paid labour on the farms either, I think.
No, but it's not paid labour, but it's. I mean,
reciprocal.
I mean, people. I think people know the value of it. You know.
Oh, yeah.
So if you work for so many days for your neighbour, I think you
owe them that.
Yeah, I think that's.
Quarter of the vegetables.
Or even the same sort of time on your property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a lot of contra work going on. There's not a lot of cash.
I mean, there's always cash coming onto this property. I think that's important because of the, again, and it's very important, women, you know, with the dairy, that's always, I mean, and eggs too. I should have mentioned eggs. They're taking eggs into Mitiamo and dairy.
To the railway.
To the railway, yeah. So the interesting about this farm is that there is throughout the year bits and pieces of cash coming in.
They're harvesting their oats and they're saving them, and they're sort of getting a regular income.
Yeah, and
selling them through the year.
Yeah, well, because if you sell them all at harvest time, you're in trouble. And what they've built at Mitiamo, I think, is a storage shed. So they can put them in the storage shed and take them out when the price is better in the winter.
But presumably they're also using them for the dairy in the winter.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about women's work? Because I did notice that the eggs and the milk weren't on your income. So is that because you record the women's produce in the diary?
Oh, he does, yeah.
Or because you didn't add it all up because it was bitsy?
It's bitsy, but he does periodically record that the amounts he's getting for milk and for eggs.
Okay, so Val and I could.
Side to it.
Any last questions for Charles?
It's very much the same now with family farms, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
It's similar on some family farms.
More technology.
Yes,
More
it's
technology. Well, yeah, but that's the interesting thing is these people are early adopters of tech. At this stage, they're early adopters of technology. Although it's interesting, I haven't really come to it yet, that they're very late. When he dies in 1937, James doesn't have a tractor.
Oh, really?
No.
He's still using horses.
Still using horses, yeah. Which is not unusual, you know, but I think a sort of a farmer established so long would have, but he's an older man, I suppose. And the other thing, I don't know much about this, but it's interesting that in that family, Glenn marries Ray and forgot the girl's name, but
Edith. Was it Edith?
they never marry. No, and I sort of wonder. I mean,
Ray was injured from the war.
Yes, him.
Yeah.
These years too.
Charles, can you talk about that generational clash conflict? I mean, that the sons obviously chose to go off and have their own farm and be away from kind of
Well,
Father.
in this case, they don't. It's a joint thing. The father is helping them out, and the quote from the mother paying off the mortgage.
Yeah, he helps them out get other farms, but didn't two of the sons?
Oh, yeah, that's in the yeah,
I went to Knowsley.
yeah.
One went to Knowsley.
Yeah.
I think that the one who goes to Knowsley, that's fairly amicable. They've just made a decision, and he borrows from his brother at your part of the world to build that farm. I just know. I mean, there's only one reference to any tension between Dick and his father.
Okay, I was just interested because in the oral histories that I did with the Mallee lads, many of them talked about, they went off to ag college and came back with all these exciting ideas and,
Conflict.
and there was conflict,
Yes.
and that was part of new technologies, new methods, and they kind of felt like there was conflict. They also kind of had to bide their time, I guess. So I guess I'm also interested in what's not said about that, in the diary, in the records, and whether there's other kind of stories about that process of generational differences, conflict.
Yeah, I don't know how you get it. I mean, it's obviously, obviously some people just leave the farm and you can pick that up. By them going off to Melbourne and doing other sorts of jobs, but how you get a conflict within the family without sort of intimate letters and diaries, I don't know.
Yeah. But he doesn't say, had a row with Dad.
No. I mean, it seems to be his relationship with his father seems to be very amicable. Sad,
Well, if there's no more questions, if you'd like to join me in thanking Charles for a really great paper. It's always a pleasure hearing your work, Charles. And next month, on the 6th of May, we have Lee McKinnon from the Golden Dragon Museum, who's going to talk about parade committees, secret societies, and Protestant missions. And he'll be looking at Bendigo, the ways that Bendigo Chinese community organisations are represented in the collection of the Golden Dragon Museum. And it won't be just before Easter weekend. More people.
So we have any audience in?
Well, no, because the Zoom dropped out, so there's no questions from
The
Zoom.
Zoom came back on, and we've had 4 from YouTube and 6 on Zoom.
Are there any questions, though?
There was a mention of great photos of, I think, the churches up near Mitiamo. From Anne Holman, she says, "My dad once owned land at Terrick. Finding the information fascinating. Thank you." Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Charles.